Okay, here's a question. You're working on a track and it's time to EQ your kick drum. So what do? You probably need to cut a little bit of 7K to make room for the cymbals, and everything above 10K could probably be cut altogether. The snare isn't going to really be punchy though without removing a little bit of 250 Hz, but you might also want to boost the upper mids while you're in there for just a bit of added knock. And because the kick has a little bit of stereo information, it's probably a good idea to use some mid-side EQ to cut the sides below 200 Hz to maintain better mono compatibility while not using too steep of a filter, or else you might interfere with the phase relationships. Adding a bit of 1K couldn't hurt either, and that might even help it translate a bit more. But with the secondary tom groove in the drop, you should probably consider a bit of dynamic EQ as well, with the low tom as the sidechain input to duck some of the resonances out of the way of the body of the toms from the kick. But on second thought, there is actually some really nice air up top that might be good to have, so maybe it's worth tweaking that 10K cut a little bit and adding a bit of sizzle. Maybe you could also toss in a bit of oomph at around 60 Hz, but that band should probably also be dynamic, or else it could start to interfere with the sub bass. Right? The unflinching cold shower of the situation, though, is that a lot of the times, a kick drum is a kick drum, and as long as it's a half-decent sample or recording, it's really not that f***ing complicated. Just because you're making dinner doesn't mean you need to use everything in the kitchen. A pizza probably doesn't need cereal, and coffee doesn't need hot sauce, and a cheeseburger probably isn't gonna need peanut butter, even though some people like that for some ungodly reason. While there is of course something to be said for the noble pursuit of mastering your tools, if that's the only thing you're doing with your time when creating, you're probably not putting all that much time into actually creating something. This isn't to say that there's not a time and a place for exploring the minutiae of artistry and production, but letting that become a constant obsession can kill the all too important flow state. Howdy doody buckaroonies, Grumpy the Elf here, and today we're gonna try and solve a case of the fucky-wuckies I seem to have myself caught in all the time. A couple days ago, I went out and bought a drum machine. I spent maybe 15 minutes with it at a Guitar Center, brought it home, didn't even read the manual, hooked it up, fired up a live stream, and played around with it. By the end of the stream, I made a track, and people seemed to really like the track. And the funny thing about it was that it was only 4 tracks. It was all the drums, summed down to 1 bus, a pad with some reverb on it, an acid sequence, and a big, thick ol' Reese bass line. And if I had to remake that right now, I could probably do that in less than 20 minutes. And therein lies the lesson and the big mistake I always find myself making. A good idea doesn't have to be complicated. Today, I want to talk about workflow and my current process for coming up with an idea for a track from the ground up with just a few simple parts and avoiding that pitfall of overcomplicating everything, because I feel like this is a lesson I have to teach myself all the time, and it's something that you can really only learn through practice. So with that, let's make some music. Lately, I've really been enjoying hardware sequencers for starting ideas and getting a session going, and this is one I've been waiting to get my hands on for a long time. This is the Oxy One, and as you can probably tell by looking at it, covering all the features and functions of this thing is well beyond the scope of this video, and that's not really the point of this video to begin with. But of course, there is a video by Loopop covering this thing in excruciating detail, going through all the functions and things that it does, so you could check that out if you want more info on all that. At its core, it's a 4-track sequencer, but every track can contain more tracks, so it's a little more complicated than that. But the nice thing is that each of these tracks has a lot of different modes and deeper functions, including per-step editing for a lot of different parameters. It's actually quite powerful, and that's what I really like about the Oxy One. Is it's a great compromise between the sort of limitless world of what you can do in a DAW and the restrictions of a piece of hardware without feeling too restricting. It's restricting in a good way because it makes you make stuff, if that makes any sense at all. For me, and probably for a lot of you as well, music, especially being more into the instrumental side of stuff, is all about kind of curating a mood and a vibe, and I think it's important to lay kind of a blanket idea down first before I can really get anything going, because if I'm just working with a blank slate, that's a lot and it's very intimidating. So one of the best ways to get started with curating a vibe and an atmosphere and all that is, of course, a pad. So I created just a basic pad using my Iridium. That was just some sine waves plucking along in key. I don't really know what I played, but then I just Paul stretched it and recorded 64 bars of the Paul stretch sound here. To make that a bit more fun, I added a filter, added some texture, seemed a bit more interesting, tremolo for just a bit of movement, pitch monster because it felt boring. This sounded super, super weird, so I smoothed it out with a bunch of reverb. That sounded super, super cool, so I added some saturation, make it a bit more meaty, beefy, cheesy, and EQ to tame it back down. And this really sets the tone right away, kind of this dark, rainy, moody something. And I've always been of the mindset that you don't write songs, you just kind of discover them. I felt like this needed a bit more vibe, so I brought in some texture. The funny thing about this is adding those cool textures doesn't have to be really that big of a deal. To do this, I actually just brought in some bubble wrap. So it's just crinkling bubble wrap. Time stretched that. Created this cool, maybe sort of vinyl-y texture and gave it some reverb. Almost kind of sounds like, I don't know, footsteps or something, and paired with the pad. Now we're in business and we're really starting to vibe. At this point, I like to just start noodling around with ideas, and a lot of ideas for me start on piano, even though piano might not end up in the finished thing. So I started off just kind of a little piano riff. Gave that some granular stuff and some reverb. So on top of the pad and that kind of crackly texture, it's just a little 8-bar piano thing. And honestly, if I was going for more of a minimal thing, especially for maybe like a score or something, this probably could work. But I wanted to spice things up a bit. So I like to actually play with manipulating recordings a fair amount. And my last album, Motions and Echoes, is basically just a bunch of that. I took that piano thing and actually just time stretched it and reversed it. I time stretched one copy and pitched it down. I added some processing with Pitch Monster and a delay, so that sounds like this. Really weird texture. Still in key though, but sounds nothing like the original. Layered that with another version pitched an octave up this time, and passed that into some reverb. And just took out the original piano recording, so in context with everything else. And here, from just kind of a couple simple moves, we've built up a whole track and a whole vibe. So now it's time to really lean into it and just trust your gut. At this point, we've really got the basic vibe going. So the first thing I do is just start up a basic sequence of some kind. So here I'm just using a single track to create kind of an acidy sequence that I'm feeding out to the Donner beat1. So let's give this a play and bring it in. Let's bring in some more probability. I liked where this was going, but I felt like it needed some more flow. So I used a chord track and laid down kind of a randomish chord progression with really low probability on everything except this first chord. So once I had this going, I just brought in a bass line. Playing around with the filter in a bit. And we're really well on our way to developing a track here. To develop this a bit further, I just want to focus in on one really cool feature and one really cool track type here, and that is the multi-track mode. So in this mode, each of these tracks is a note, and it can be polyphonic, but you can do all sorts of really interesting things. So to start building on top of this, I fed out another sequence using multi-track mode here to my microfreak. And if I give this a play, you'll see what it's doing. Let's bring in this track. Let's just focus on this one for a minute. So the fun thing with this is we can set different rates for each of these tracks, but even individual step endpoints for these lanes. So let's do that now. Just kind of picking at random. Don't really care. Maybe something like that. Let's do this. Now we've got this really complex melodic sequence that just seems to flow and evolve forever. So bringing that against our chords, and let's bring in the acid sequence. And just those 3 tracks work super well. Pairing that all up against the other stuff we've created so far, now we've got this. Now let's bring in some drums. Maybe we could make a new sequence here and a new part of this track by just killing these sequences and making it a bit more minimal. And that's a really powerful idea, I think. This sort of addition by subtraction. We've built a whole new section of the track here just by taking things away rather than adding new things. So maybe the next section. Starts to build a bit. Let's bring in the chords and the acid thing here. And then maybe get ready to move over to some different patterns, because we can store different patterns and sequences for each of these tracks. rewind things down a bit here. And bring it down. And that can be a track. It's really that simple. We've built up a really great core idea from only 4 tracks here on the Oxy, layered it with some ideas on the DAW that we used to kickstart the vibe and the atmosphere, and all of a sudden, you're cooking with fire. I was moving this stuff over to get this outro shot, and I thought this lighting was like really dramatic, so I think we're just gonna roll with it. So yeah, that's the video. That is my workflow lately, and I think this is a fun and really effective way to work, to just make a piece of music from as few elements as possible, as quickly as possible. Like when we soloed out just the stuff coming from the Oxy there, that was 3 tracks, and that already felt like a completed idea, more or less, that we could easily develop. And I think the idea of addition by subtraction as well is particularly powerful, because in the DAW, there's always this urge to keep layering and doing and adding stuff, and that doesn't really have to be what you do, because eventually you just reach peak stuff and then there's nowhere to go from there. If you give everything away, you can't build from that. So having that full picture from only a handful of elements and building new sections by subtracting from it or making changes is a great way to work and develop music that I think is more focused and intentional and just easier to digest, because it's not a bunch of stuff competing for your attention. So that is your assignment for the week. Go out and try and make a piece of music as quickly as you can from as few elements as you can. You might be surprised at what you can take away from those sorts of sessions. And I guess that's it. A big thank you to Oxy for sending along the Oxy One here. It's earned a pretty much permanent space on my desk. I love working with this thing, and if you want to check it out for yourself, of course, there's links down in the description below. That wraps everything up for this one. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you learned something. And of course, as always, I hope this inspires you to get out there and make something awesome.